welcome to today's explainer. As a clinical psychologist, I constantly see patients who literally, no matter how early they start getting ready, always end up running 10 minutes behind. It's so easy to just label this as a simple failure of discipline, right? Or just plain disorganization. But today, we're going to look at chronic lateness through a totally different clinical lens. We are uncovering the hidden psychological architecture behind why some minds simply cannot align with a clock. So why are some people always 10 minutes late? Look, whether you're the chronically late person yourself or you're the super punctual friend who's constantly waiting on them, you've definitely experienced this. Have you ever noticed someone, or hey, maybe it's you, texting on my way while actually still sitting on the couch, literally just putting on their shoes? It's a universal frustration. But as you'll see, it's actually driven by a highly specific way the brain perceives time and structure. The core clinical concept at play here is what we call time blindness. But honestly, it's way more than just losing track of the minutes. It's actually a subconscious mechanism where the brain misperceives time and actively resists imposed schedules. Why? To maintain autonomy. We're completely shifting the paradigm today. Let's move away from this old idea of bad time management and start looking at lateness as what it really is, a complex internal defense system. Here is our clinical roadmap for today's behavioral autopsy. We are going to cover the lateness illusion, time as an identity threat, process over outcome, the psychological shield, and finally, rewiring your clock. All right, let's dive right into section 1, the lateness illusion, dismantling the myth of disrespect. Society makes some pretty harsh assumptions about lateness. People immediately assume it means you're disrespectful of their time, highly disorganized, or just totally lacking discipline. But the clinical psychological reality? It is vastly different. Subconsciously, the chronically late person is actually protecting their personal identity. They're managing a really deep need for autonomy and seeking an internal sense of control. Far from being a flaw, it's actually a subconscious architecture built for safety. Moving on to section 2, time as an identity threat, the chronological rebel. Okay, so this is where it gets fascinating because it becomes crystal clear why simply telling someone to be there at 5 can completely backfire. In my clinical practice, I often see this chronological rebel mindset stemming straight from specific childhood dynamics. Think about it. Children who grew up in overly controlling environments often develop these really damaging patterns of hyperindependence in adulthood. To these individuals, a schedule doesn't feel like helpful guidance. No, it feels like an imposed structure. It's a direct threat that removes their power of individual choice. Subconsciously, their identity is so built on independent thinking that following a strict timeline literally feels like losing a part of who they are and returning to that vulnerable state of being controlled. Now for section 3, process over outcome, the conflict of completion. So there's a fundamental difference in what these brains prioritize. Think about a highly punctual mind. It focuses almost entirely on the outcome, right? Arriving exactly at 5 p.m. Everything they do is in service of that specific outcome. But the late mind, it operates completely differently. They focus almost exclusively on the process. How they do something matters way more than what they achieve. So interrupting their current task, like, say, finishing a really good chapter of a book or perfecting their hair to meet some external deadline, it feels deeply, fundamentally wrong to them. They'd honestly rather arrive late on their own terms, knowing they properly finished what they started, than arrive on time but feel like they sacrificed their own standards for someone else's clock. And this leads to one of the most fascinating quirks of the late mind, how it totally confuses thinking with actual progress. Check this out. At 0 minutes, they start mentally rehearsing the route. Okay, great. By 10 minutes, they're overthinking every single step of getting ready. But by that 20-minute mark, a psychological trap snaps completely shut. By imagining the task so vividly, the brain actually experiences the satisfaction of the trip. It's almost as if the work is already done. The result? At 30 minutes, there has been zero actual physical movement toward the door. Their mental rehearsal completely drained their internal urgency to take physical action. Wild, right? Which brings us to section 4, the psychological shield, regaining control and safety. When life feels overwhelmingly unpredictable, taking control of your own schedules seems like a totally healthy coping mechanism. But we really have to contrast healthy self-reliance with damaging patterns of hyperindependence. The cycle usually starts like this. An individual feels completely overwhelmed by their chaotic environment. So, to create a subtle sense of comfort, they subconsciously reject dictated timelines. They decide to become the internal driver of their own schedule to restore that sense of safety and control. But here's the catch. While handling it yourself by arriving on your own time provides some temporary relief, this hyper-independent refusal to adapt to external reality ultimately just creates more chaos. There's also a really significant social dynamic happening here. The late mind generally has a super high tolerance for uncertainty. They don't rely on rigid systems to feel grounded, so they naturally view set times as, well, mere suggestions. And lateness is often quietly used to avoid the cost of being seen too clearly. Think about it. Arriving exactly on time often means being the first one there, sitting in the spotlight, and having to engage in all that awkward small talk. Arriving late acts as a psychological shield. It allows them to slip into a room safely, right into the background. However, and this is a big however, in clinical practice, we see exactly how the specific defensive habit creates severe distance within long-term personal relationships. Partners very often interpret this chronic, hyper-independent lateness as emotional unavailability or a flat-out refusal to compromise. And over time, that slowly, quietly erodes intimacy. And finally, Section 5, rewiring your clock, from blame to management. I want you to really absorb this quote. Lateness isn't always a character flaw. It's often a sign of a mind wired for autonomy. Understanding these clinical patterns is absolutely the first step towards self-management because it removes the shame. It really does. Once you recognize that your brain is simply relying on hyper-independent defenses to protect your independence or to manage your mental energy, you can stop fighting that useless guilt. You can finally start figuring out how to actually adapt. So, I'll leave you with this. How will you balance your need for freedom with the reality of the world around you? If this explainer helped you understand the clinical realities behind why you, or maybe your partner, are always running behind, take this knowledge and use it. Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the real psychology of our everyday habits. Because honestly, once you understand the root of the pattern, you stop judging the behavior and you finally understand the mind. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.